5 Children and It by E. Nesbit. Chapter 7. A Siege and Bed. The children were sitting in the gloomy banquet hall at the end of one of the long bare wooden tables, and there was no hope. Martha had brought in lunch, but lunch was invisible, and though they ran their hands along the tabletop, they could feel nothing, and knew for certain that they couldn't feel lunch either. Suddenly, Cyril felt in his pocket. "Oh, right," he cried. "Look here, I got biscuits. Somewhat broken and crumbled, but still certainly biscuits. 3 whole ones, and a generous handful of fragments and crumbs. I got them this morning. I quite forgot," he explained. He divided them with fairness into 4 separate heaps. They were eaten in happy silence, though they had an odd taste because they had been in Cyril's pocket all morning.
"Look here, Cyril,"
said Robert.
"You're so clever at explaining about invisibleness and all of that, but how is it that the biscuits are here? And bread and meat and things have disappeared?"
"I don't know," said Cyril after a pause. "Unless it's because we had them, and nothing about us has changed. Everything in my pocket's all right."
"So if we had the button, it would be real? Oh, I wish we could find it."
"But we can't find it. I suppose it isn't really ours until we've got it into our mouths." "Or in our pockets," said Jane, thinking of the biscuits. "Who puts mutton in their pockets, you silly girl?" said Cyril. "But I know what you mean. At any rate, I'll try it." He leaned over the table with his face about an inch from it, kept opening and shutting his mouth, as if he were trying to take bites out of the air.
"It's no good. You'll only—" "Oh!"
Cyril stood up with a grin of triumph on his face, holding a square piece of bread in his mouth. It was quite real. Everyone could see it. It was true that directly he bit off a piece, the rest vanished. But it was all right, because he knew he had it in his hand, even though he could neither see nor feel it. He took another bite, from the air between his fingers, and it turned to bread just as he bit it down. The next moment, all the others were following his example, opening and shutting their mouths an inch from the table, barely looking. Robert captured a slice of mutton. But I think I will draw a veil over the rest of this painful scene. It is enough to say that they had enough mutton. When Martha came to change the plates, she said she had never seen such a mess in all her days. But the great thing after all was that they had had dinner, and now everyone felt more courage to prepare for the attack that was to be delivered before sunset. Robert was captain and insisted on climbing to the top of one of the towers as reconnaissance, so up they all went. And now they could see all around the castle, and could see, too, what was beyond the moat. On every side, tents of the besieging party were pitched. Rather uncomfortable shivers ran down the children's backs, as they saw that all of the men were busy cleaning and sharpening their arms, and restringing their bows and polishing their shields. A large party came across the road, with horses dragging along a great trunk of a tree, and Cyril felt quite pale, because he knew this was to be a battering ram. "It's a good thing we've got a moat," he said. "And it's a good thing the drawbridge is up. I wouldn't have known how to work it."
"Of course it would be up in a besieged castle. You'd think there ought to have been soldiers on it, wouldn't you?"
said Robert. "You see, I don't know how long it's been besieged," said Cyril darkly. "Perhaps most of the brave defenders were killed early in the siege, and all the provisions eaten, and now there's only a few survivors, and that's us. And we're going to defend it or starve to death." "How do you begin defending to the death, I mean?" asked Anthea. "We ought to be heavily armed, and then shoot at them when they advance to the attack." "They used to pour boiling lead on besiegers when they got too close," said Anthea. "Father showed me the holes where they would pour it down Burnham Castle, and there are holes like it on the gate tower over there." "I think I'm glad it's only a game. It is only a game, isn't it?" said Jane. No one answered. The children found plenty of strange weapons in the castle, and if they were armed at all, it was soon plain that they would be, as Cyril said, armed heavily, for these swords and lances and crossbows were far too weighty even for Cyril's manly little arms, and as for the longbows, none of the children could even begin to bend them. The daggers were better, but Jane hoped that the besiegers would not come close enough for daggers to be of any use. Never mind. We can hurl them like javelins, said Cyril, or drop them onto people's heads. I say, there's a lot of stones on the other side of the courtyard. Maybe we should take some up, to drop on their heads, if they're swimming in the moat. So a heap of stones were gathered up above the gate. Another heap, a shining, dangerous-looking heap of daggers and knives. As Anthea was crossing the courtyard for more stones, a sudden and valuable idea came to her. She went to Martha and said, May we have just biscuits for tea? We're trying to play at besieged castles, and we like the biscuits as provisions for the garrison. Put mine in my pocket, please. My hands are so dirty, and I'll tell the others to fetch theirs. This was indeed a happy thought, for now the 4 generous handfuls of air, which turned to biscuits as Martha crammed them in their pockets, the garrison was well provisioned until sundown. They brought up some iron pots of cold water to pour onto the besiegers instead of hot lead, with which the castle did not seem to be provisioned. The afternoon passed with wonderful quickness. It was very exciting, but none of them, except Robert, could feel all the time that this was really dangerous work. To the others, who only seen the camp and the besiegers from a distance, the whole thing seemed like a game of make-believe, and a splendidly distant, perfectly safe dream. But it was only now and then that they could understand what Robert felt like. When it seemed to be tea time, the biscuits were eaten, with water from a deep well in the courtyard. Cyril insisted on putting by 8 biscuits, just in case anyone should feel faint during the battle. Just as he was putting away the reserve of biscuits, in a sort of stone cupboard without a door, a sudden sound made him drop 3 of them. It was a loud, fierce cry of a trumpet.
You see, it is real,
said Robert.
They're going to attack.
All rushed to the narrow windows.
Yes,
said Robert.
They're all coming out of their tents and moving like ants. There's that Jackin dancing about. I wish he could see me put my tongue out at him. Ha!
The others were far too pale to put their tongues out at anybody. They looked at Robert with surprised respect, and Anthea said, You really are brave, Robert. Right. Cyril turned. He's been getting ready to be brave all this afternoon, and I wasn't ready. That's all. I should be braver. Oh, dear, said Jane. What does it matter which of you is the bravest? I think Cyril's perfectly silly to wish for a castle, and I don't want to play any more.
It isn't,
said Robert sternly, but Anthea interpreted. Oh, yes, you do, she said coaxingly. It's a very nice game, really, because they couldn't possibly get in, and if they do, women and children are always spared by civilized armies. But are you quite sure they are civilized? Asked Jane. They seem to be from so long ago. Of course they are, said Anthea, pointing cheerfully through the narrow window. Why, look at the little flags on their lances, how bright and fine. And look at their leader. He seems like a nice man. Isn't he, Robert, on that grey horse? Jane consented to look, and the scene was almost too pretty to be alarming. The green tuff, the white tents, the flash of lances, the glimmer of armor, and the bright colors of scarves and tunics. It was just like a page out of a picture book. The trumpets were sounding, and the trumpeters stopped for breath. The children could hear the clang-clang of armor and murmur of voices. A trumpeter came forward to the edge of the moat, which now seemed much narrower than at first, and blew the longest and loudest blast they had heard yet. When the blaring noise had died away, a man who was with the trumpeter shouted, What ho within there! And his voice came plainly to the garrison in the gatehouse.
Hello there!
Robert bellowed back. In the name of our Lord the King, and of the good Lord and trustworthy leader, Sir Wilfrid de Talbot, we summon this castle to surrender on pain of fire and sword. Do you surrender?
No!
Shouted Robert.
Never! We won't! Never!
The man answered back. Then your fate be on your heads.
Cheer!
Said Robert in a fierce whisper.
Cheer to show them we aren't afraid. 1, 2, 3. Hip hip hooray!
Hip hip hooray! The cheers were rather high and weak, but the rattle of the daggers lent them strength. There was another shout from the camp across the moat. And then the beguiled fortress felt that the attack had indeed begun. It was getting rather dark in the room above the gatehouse, and Jane took little courage as she remembered sunset couldn't be far off now. "The moat is dreadfully thin," said Anthea.
"But they couldn't get into the castle even if they do swim over it,"
said Robert, and he spoke. He heard heavy feet on the stair outside. No one breathed for a moment. The steel and the feet went on up the turret stairs. Then Robert sprang softly to the door and pulled off his shoes.
"Wait here,"
he whispered. He peeped into the upper room. The man was there, Jackin, dripping with moat water, and he was fumbling about with the machinery to lower the drawbridge. Robert banged the door suddenly and turned a great key in the lock. Just as Jackin sprang to the inside of the door, he tore downstairs into the little turret at the foot of the tower, where the biggest window was.
"We ought to have defended this,"
he cried to the others as they followed him. He was just in time. Another man had swum over, and his fingers were on the window edge. Robert never knew how the man had managed to climb up out of the water, but he saw the clinging fingers and hit them as hard as he could with an iron bar that he had caught up from the floor. The men fell with a splash onto the moat water. In another moment, Robert was outside the little room. He had banged the door shut and was throwing over an enormous bolt and calling to Cyril to lend a hand. Then they stood in the arched gatehouse, breathing hard and looking at each other. Jane's mouth was open.
"Cheer up, Jenny,"
said Robert.
"It won't last much longer."
There was creaking above, and something rattled and shook. The pavement they stood on seemed to tremble. Then a crash told them that the drawbridge had been lowered in its place.
"That's that beast Jackin,"
said Robert.
"There's still the portcullis. I'm almost certain that worked from lower down."
And now the drawbridge rang and echoed hollowly with hooves and horses and armed men.
"Up, quick,"
said Robert.
"Drop the thing."
Even the girls were feeling almost brave now. They followed Robert quickly, and under his direction began to drop stones from the narrow window above. There was a confused noise below and some groans. "Oh dear," said Anthea, putting down a stone she was going to drop down. "I'm afraid we've hurt somebody." Robert caught up the stone in a fury.
"I should hope we have,"
he said.
"I'd give someone a jolly good boiling kettle of lead. Surrender indeed."
And now came more tramping, and a pause, and there was a thunderous thump, and the battering ram, and the little room was almost pitch dark.
"We've held it,"
cried Robert.
"We won't surrender. The sun must set in a minute. Here, they're all underneath us again. Pity there's no time to get more stones. Here, pour the water down on them. It's no good, of course, but at least they'll hate it."
"Oh dear," said Jane. "Don't you think we'd better surrender?"
"Never,"
said Robert.
"We'll have a parley if you like, but we'll never surrender. Oh, I'll be a soldier when I grow up. You just see if I don't. I won't go about civil service, whatever anyone says."
"Let's wave a handkerchief for parley," Jane pleaded. "I don't believe the sun's going to set tonight at all."
"Give them the water first, you brutes,"
said the bloodthirsty Robert. So Anthea tilted the pot over the nearest lean hole and poured. They heard a splash below, but no one below seemed to have felt it, and again the ram battered on and on against the great door. Anthea paused.
"How idiotic,"
said Robert, lying flat on the floor, putting one eye to the lead hole.
"Of course the holes go straight down into the gate. That's for when the enemy has gotten past the door and the portcullis. Almost all is lost. Here, hand me the pot."
He crawled onto the 3-corridored edge of the middle of the wall, and taking the pot from Anthea, he poured the water out through a narrow slit. And as he began to pour, the noise of the battering ram, and the trampling of the foe, and the shouts of "Surrender!" and "De Talbot forever!" all suddenly stopped and went on like a sniff of a candle, and the little dark room seemed to whirl around topsy-turvy, and the children came to themselves. They were safe and sound in the big front bedroom of their own house. They all crowded to the window and looked out. The moat and the tents of the besieging fortress were gone. And there was a garden, a tangle of dandelions and marigolds and asters and roses, and the spiked iron railing, and the quiet little road. Everyone drew a deep breath.
"It's all right,"
said Robert.
"I told you so, and I say, we didn't surrender, did we?"
"Aren't you glad now I wished for a castle?" asked Cyril. "I think I am now," said Anthea. "But I wouldn't wish for it again." "Oh, it was simply splendid," said Jane unexpectedly. "I wasn't frightened a bit." "Oh, now I say," Cyril began, but Anthea stopped him. "Look here," she said. "It's just come to my head. This was the first thing we wished for that hasn't gotten us in trouble. And there hasn't been the last little scrap about this. Everyone's fine downstairs, we're safe and sound, and we've had a jolly good day. At least, well, not jolly exactly, but you know what I mean. And now we know how brave Robert is, and Cyril, too, of course," she added hastily, "and Jane, well, and we shan't have row about this with a single grown-up." The door opened suddenly and fiercely. "You ought to be ashamed of yourselves," said the voice of Martha, and they could tell in her voice that she was very angry indeed. "I thought you couldn't last a day without getting up to some mischief. A person can't take a breath of fresh air out of the front doorstep when you empty a jug of water on their heads. Off to bed with you, the lot of you, and try to wake up as better children tomorrow morning. Now then, don't you make me tell you twice. If I find any of you aren't in bed in 10 minutes, you'll have it." She flounced out amid a chorus of regrets and apologies. The children were very sorry, but really, it wasn't their faults at all. You can't help it if you're pouring water on a besieging foe of the castle when the castle suddenly changes to your house and everything changes except the water that happens to fall on someone else's head. "I don't know why the water didn't change into anything, though," said Cyril.
"Why should it? Water's water all over the world."
"I expect the castle, well, was the same as ours in the stable yard," said Jane, and that really was the case. "I thought we couldn't get a wish day without a row," said Cyril. "It was much too good to be true. Come on, my military hero. If we get into bed sharp, she won't be angry, and perhaps she'll bring us some supper. I'm jolly well hungry. Come on, kids." "Good night. I hope the castle won't come creeping back in the night," said Jane. "Of course it won't," said Anthea briskly, "but Martha will. Not in the middle of the night, but in any minute. Come here. Turn round. You got a knot in your pinafore string." "Wouldn't it be degrading for Sir Wilfrid de Talbot," said Jane dreamily, "if he could have known that half the besieged garrison force wore pinafores? And the other half knickerbockers. Yes, frighteningly." "Here, stand still now. You're only tightening the knot," said Anthea.